Good afternoon, and welcome to the virtual briefing on the chemical supply chain. My name is Ray Garrett, and I lead public policy activities at the American Chemical Society. For those of you who are unfamiliar with ACS, we are a congressionally chartered not-for-profit scientific society. Our membership includes over 150,000 chemists, chemical engineers, and allied professionals worldwide. This webinar is part of the ACS Science in the Congress program, which aims to educate and inform members of Congress and their staffs on the importance of science and technology to solving national challenges. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our co-sponsor for this event, U.S. Pharmacopeia, and to recognize the ACS Corporation Associates program for their help in identifying speakers for this panel. Today's panel of experts will be discussing the role of the chemical supply chain, including pandemic impacts in the United States, as well as public policy actions that positively impact the supply chain's role in our economy and in addressing the pandemic. Our three speakers will begin this webinar with short presentations, after which we will transition into a virtual Q&A session with you, the audience. The presentations and conversations you will hear today are being recorded and will be made available on our website for future use. To submit your questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you are joining us by phone, you may email your questions to science_congress@acs.org. We will be monitoring the questions throughout the webinar and hope to have time for our panel to address as many of them as possible. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the day. Mr. Robert Mccarver, Head of Government Affairs North America for Covestro LLC. Rob has 30 years of public policy experience in chemicals and manufacturing. He also has an extensive corporate association and consulting background. Rob, please get us started with today's program.
Thank you, Ray, and thank you to everybody who's joined the call today. We look forward to an interesting discussion, a timely discussion, and we encourage questions. We look forward to a chance to interact with the audience as we go along. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you, Brandy. I laugh when I see this picture. I think if anybody could see me at the moment, you would assume that there's been a year-long disruption in the supply chain for razors and beard trimmers, but we're not here to talk about that today. We're here to talk about the supply chain in the chemical sector and how it's been impacted during the corona pandemic. Next slide, please. Our panelists today are Kevin Swift, who is the chief economist with the American Chemistry Council. ACC is the leading association for the chemical sector in the United States, and Covestro is a very active member in the ACC. Mike Levy is the senior vice president for digital and innovation at U.S. Pharmacopeia. As Ray mentioned, it's a nonprofit organization that sets standards for medicines, food ingredients, and dietary supplements. And our third panelist is Paul Bowman, my colleague at Covestro, where he is the Director of Supply Chain Planning and Improvement. He's a 30-year industry veteran with company-based expertise in R&D, manufacturing, and supply chain logistics. Next slide, please. So I thought I would start with a brief overview of how the supply chain works in the chemical sector. If you look in the lower left, the first step in the process is getting raw materials into the chain. And so that could be bio-based raw materials. It could be hydrocarbons from oil, natural gas, or coal. But those go to the suppliers. In this scenario, that means companies like mine. We take the raw materials, we convert them into different chemical products and sell them to our customers in the manufacturing world. They then take those products and convert them into finished goods, which will be distributed to retailers. Retailers put them out for sale, and ultimately they get to the end customer. The distribution is not, the distribution that's relevant to the discussion today is not just between the manufacturing sites and the retailers, but there's also a network of planes, trains, and automobiles and pipelines that work between from the raw material to the supplier to the manufacturer to keep the production going, to keep the raw materials and inputs going from one step of the process to another. And it is a very complex and ongoing system. But as we'll hear today, there are challenges that can be presented to keeping the flow of goods, and what our industry does to respond to that is critical to understanding how it all works. If you go to the next slide, please. So in thinking about how our sector was impacted by COVID, the chemical sector is necessarily nimble and flexible. You may not think of big manufacturing operations being that way, but we have to be. We have a vast array of different inputs that we need for the products that we make. Our customers need a variety of products for the materials that they produce, and it's an intricate web. And when one part of that network breaks, you have to fill it in as quickly as possible, either from alternative supply sources or finding different end users for the goods that you're producing, so that everything can continue to flow smoothly. For that to be successful, a lot of contingency planning goes into the process. My company and our competitors do a great deal to plan for unexpected events. That can be acts of God like hurricanes, or as we saw last week in Texas, the unexpected low temperature conditions, which were extremely challenging for the energy grid, but that also resulted in impacts on chemical manufacturing. If we don't have energy to power our operations, then everything breaks down. So we had to scramble a bit. But the biggest event recently, of course, is the coronavirus. And that was unexpected, to say the least. But it required the industry to respond and to think creatively about how to either find alternate sources of input, or to potentially send materials to other applications, like a lot of the PPE and other materials that were used in responding to the virus. Sorry, phone ringing in the background. All right, so anyway, so to get back on track, we were accustomed to planned and unplanned disruptions. Some of the planned disruptions are on an annual basis. Our plants are generally taken down for repair and maintenance operations, and planned shutdown is something that's easier to prepare for. It's the unplanned things that are more disruptive. But I think what we saw is we were largely able to keep things going. As one example of an impact this year, one of Covestro's key raw material inputs that is used to make hand sanitizers, not by us, but by other companies, that obviously was in high demand. And so supply for our normal use was diverted, and we had to find alternative sources of supply or an alternative material to use to produce our goods. But again, I think that the company and the industry responded well to those sorts of challenges. One more localized example where there were some serious disruptions is at the state level, where you had contradictory and confusing state rules on truckers and even employees crossing state lines. This slowed things down considerably, both in transportation and production. And so again, presented some hurdles that the industry needed to overcome. But it's important to remember how critical the chemical sector is to the response to the pandemic. I mean, the materials that we make, as I said, go into hand sanitizers, disinfectants, personal protective equipment. Covestro makes materials that go into a lot of medical applications like IV tubes, ventilators, et cetera. So we're right there in the middle of the corona response. Next slide, please. The chemical sector also is, in normal times, plays a central role in both the US and global economies. We are deemed critical infrastructure by the Department of Homeland Security, and our employees are essential employees. So when the virus first hit the United States, and there was a lot of mad scrambling going on to determine who should be out and about, what kind of restrictions needed to be placed on citizens to try to reduce the risk of transmission, our employees were deemed essential and therefore able to go into the production sites. And a lot of steps were taken, of course, to protect them and keep them safe, not only around each other, but with the transportation and distribution folks who come to our site to pick up or deliver goods. But transportation and infrastructure are critical also to making the supply chain work. And that's roads, bridges, rails, runways. They're all essential to a functioning chemical supply chain. And one of the things that's relevant to our discussion today is that the country's infrastructure right now is in pretty bad shape and is in need of some significant federal investments. So when we get to the policy part of the discussion, I think that's relevant. Likewise, tariffs have made it harder for us to move our goods around. Not only do we have a supply chain within the United States, but we have a global supply chain. And for goods coming into the country that are subject to often punitive tariffs that can be very disruptive to the overall functioning of the supply chain. And that includes a lot of goods that are used in the production of essential COVID response materials. The cold chain storage also was impacted. So you have to keep some of these vaccines at extremely low temperatures, and without the right materials to make the cooling devices to keep those vaccines at the right temperature, that could disrupt and slow down distribution of the vaccines. And finally, the tariffs also have impacts on other industries that use these same materials. And just as an example from the Covestro perspective, that includes the automotive industry, building and construction, appliances, et cetera. And sort of related to that, we've seen that there are current slowdowns in automotive production because of sluggish manufacturing of semiconductors. And we'll touch on that again in a minute as well. But it's certainly something that's been in the news. So one thing I think our industry would call for is some tariff relief similar to what was proposed in last year's Toomey Hassan Stop PPE Taxes bill that would have temporarily suspended the tariffs on Section 301 imports from China of any medical products used in COVID response. I think that's still appropriate and necessary today. And reducing those tariffs or eliminating those tariffs would enable quicker response and recovery and help with the reestablishment of our economic system. And so finally, the latest development is yesterday's executive order out of the White House, key federal agencies to conduct a 100-day review of the country's supply chains. This will look at trying to keep supply chains resilient, diverse, and secure, with the objective of supporting domestic manufacturing. It directs a 100-day supply chain review, and that some of the agencies involved, Department of Commerce, is directed to look at semiconductors and advanced packaging, which could include relevant chemistries. Likewise, the Department of Energy is tasked with looking at high capacity batteries. That includes a number of chemicals and plastic materials, including some products that Covestro makes. And the Department of Defense is tasked with looking at critical minerals and other strategic materials and the associated supply chain. So the bottom line, all of these assessments could include numerous links to the chemical sector. The outcome of this review is intended to be a series of reports that will that will reflect stakeholder consultation. They will consider risks to supply chains and industrial bases. They're to do deep dives on resilience and capacity. They are to prioritize critical goods and materials, and then most importantly for this discussion, recommend policy changes to ensure resilient supply chains. So I think overall this is a positive and encouraging development, but the industry sector will be working closely with the administration to make sure that our views are reflected in those discussions and evaluations. And then finally, not surprisingly, China has already challenged the feasibility and impact of this effort, I think feeling that it's in some ways directed at removing or discouraging further investment in China and using their material production as part of our supply chain. So I've gone on too long already. Let me turn to our first speaker. Kevin Swift is with the American Chemistry Council.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Let's go to the slide and the slide after that. We'll jump right into the matter. And chemistry is used extensively in our economy. I'm going to concentrate largely today on basic chemicals, which includes organics, inorganics, plastic resins, and other synthetic materials. I'm not really going to talk about specialty chemicals, which is the sometimes more value-added, higher price point chemistry that is performance-oriented for end-use customers. 85% of all of these chemicals go into other industrial sectors in construction. Our largest customer industry is rubber and plastic products, but it's the rest of the manufacturing industry and mining as well. And in turn, those industries sell to other industries and ultimately ends up with the consumer. We generally divide the market into several large macroeconomic end-use markets: retail, packaging materials for products; housing and building and construction, like vehicles and other transportation equipment, aircraft, aerospace; things that go in the home, appliances, furniture, and home furnishings; machinery, industrial; healthcare. Our materials are critical. Rob pointed this out, to the PPE and sanitizers. And then we have a very large export market. As much as 25% of plastic resins, for example, are exported. We are a low-cost producer, have a comparative advantage to the world. Let's go to the next slide, please. And this just shows one chain in chemistry. There's actually 7 chains. Beyond ethylene, there is propylene, butadiene, benzene, toluene, the xylenes, methanol, in terms of petrochemicals. And then there's 1 or 2 other chains. Chloralkali would be one. That's an inorganic chemical. And then ammonia, urea, which goes into fertilizers. This is simplified. A colleague of mine, if we start here with natural gas and crude oil, and then the natural gas liquids, which are cracked to make ethylene, which then go into other products, other chemical products. A colleague and I attempted at one point to try and number these. And literally, as I said, this is simplified. We could fill this up with roughly, we believe, about 5,000 to 6,000 chemical products, which in turn probably go into hundreds of thousands of manufactured goods ultimately. And so this is just a few of those. So let's go to the next slide, please. And again, this is just one chain. It's probably the largest. Next slide, please. And one of the things that we look at is, in terms of our competitiveness, is the ratio of oil to natural gas. Most of the rest of the world uses a starting material, a heavy liquid called naphtha, which is highly correlated with the price of oil, so Brent. Ethane is a natural gas liquid. It's separated largely as natural gas comes on shore, and it's highly correlated with the price of the Henry Hub. So rough rule of thumb is that when the oil to natural gas ratio is above 7, we're relatively advantaged. When it's below 7, we aren't. There has been times, as you can see, early in the last decade when the ratio was 40-1. That fostered, for example, an incredible amount of investment projects. I think our latest count is over 340 projects at a value of about $210 billion, some of which are completed. So let's go to the next slide. What that is doing, some of these investments, is if you were to look at the geography of ethylene production last year, most of it was concentrated in the Gulf Coast. As Rob had mentioned, we have 70, 80 years of experience of dealing with hurricanes. Dealing with snow and very cold weather in Texas is unusual, but we're used to it up north. But with all of these projects that have been announced, and let's go to the next slide, we're starting to see the development of a petrochemical hub in Appalachia. Now, this greater share, the capacity is growing, roughly about 20 or 25% this decade. Last year and this year were big years for adding capacity, but more will be in Appalachia. This counts only projects that have been announced or that are in design, construction. And so there is potential for even greater market share in Appalachia. There's a couple of projects, one of which is close to a final investment decision, but I don't include that here. So let's go to the next slide, please. There's another small hub in the Midwest. Again, we look at basic chemicals, we look at inventories. Let's go, well, that's fine. This just shows day supplies of materials. Actually, it's been creeping up since the Fukushima earthquake in 2011, slightly, but a general upward trend instead of just in time, maybe just in case of supply chain disruptions. We've had a few severe hurricanes, Harvey being one. What happened during the COVID was there was a drawdown of inventories, as you can see here. So let's look forward to the next slide, please. This just shows all of those materials. That vertical line to the left shows history. And this is our projection for the next 5 years going forward. Kind of a V-shaped recovery. The industry had mixed results. One of the interesting things is that because plastics are used in, say, PPE equipment, polypropylene is a resin that goes into the nonwovens that go into gowns and things such as that, wipes, and many of the other materials, polycarbonate and medical devices and tubing and things like that. The plastic segment actually was one of the few industries last year to grow. It grew, we believe, about 4.3% last year. There were only a few U.S. manufacturing industries that managed to do that last year, like semiconductors being one. It just underscores the importance of this industry and the ubiquity of our materials that go into other products. 96% of all manufactured goods are directly touched by chemistry. It's either in the processing or the component. If you go to the indirect effects, it's 100%. Some of the other segments didn't fare as well. For example, synthetic rubber, with the virtual closure of the automobile industry in April, tire production went down, so that had a significant effect. But going forward, most of these segments will be growing. Fibers is somewhat problematic because that services in the apparel industry or textile products, which is largely moved offshore. So that's a sector that's in decline, but what's left is largely supplying the domestic customer base and is really concentrated with specialty type products. So let's go to the next slide, please. COVID came about time last year. We were starting to prepare our annual economic survey, so we had questions, and we just asked, the companies, what are some of the challenges you're facing, last year or in 2020 versus 2019. And again, this is just some of the results. More weaker global growth. It was a global recession. It's an unprecedented recession. We just saw a history in the making. Very weak economy and sales for a lot of our products. And here's some of the other challenges. Let's go to the next slide, please, which shows were some specific things. The negative impact was about 4/5 of the companies surveyed were negatively impacted. Some were positively impacted. And a number experienced both increased and decreased demand for certain products. Most of our companies are not one product companies. They have broad product lines. This just shows the results of that. Let's go to the next slide, please. And it was conducted, in late April, early May last year. What was the response? Well, they implemented workforce adjustments. They curtailed capital expenditures, put some on delay, stretched projects out, curtailed production. As I said, delayed or canceled some projects, some partial shutdowns, but it's quickly returned. We've had, as I said before, a V-shaped recovery. So let's go to the next slide, please. Which shows some of the adjustments that were made in response. Rob mentioned how we're critical to the infrastructure. I remember in April and May, I had a card from the DHS, which I printed off, which I kind of carried with me in case I got pulled over or whatever. Unfortunately, I never was, but we're critical workers. We're providing the raw materials, isopropanol, ethyl alcohol, things going into hand sanitizers. Companies, some responded by increasing benefits and wages, incentives. Workforce development has been an issue for the industry for the last decade or so, and others, implemented workforce adjustments that temporarily led to decreased hours worked, et cetera. So let's go to the next slide, which kind of summarizes the outlook for the industry. Really depends on access to abundant and affordable energy, a favorable regulatory environment, a reasonable one, the state of the US and global economy, access to global supply chains, and access to export markets. We are the nation's largest exporting sector, and we maintain a very, very large trade surplus. So let's go to the next slide, which is contact information if you want to contact me later. I guess we're going to do questions later. So Rob, if you could take it to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Our next speaker is Mike Levy.
Great. Thank you very much, Rob and Kevin. We can go on to the next slide. So thank you very much for having me here. I'd like to talk about two main things. The first thing is I'd like to talk a little bit about USP and just make sure that I can communicate who USP is and what we do. And then I'll talk about insights on the medicine supply chain and its vulnerabilities. So we can go ahead to the next slide. And again, please. Thank you. So USP is a 200-year-old organization. We were created in 1820. This is a painting on the right side of our creation, 11 founding members who essentially decided that where you are in the country shouldn't decide what kind of medicines you get or the quality of the medicines that you get. So no matter where you are in the US, you should be able to access quality medicines. And as I said, we were created with that founding sort of principle, and that has continued to be our mission since the founding. So to improve global health through public standards and related programs that help ensure the quality, safety, and benefit of medicines and foods. We set the quality standards that are enforced by the FDA. And we do that because we are the official medicines compendium in the US. Next slide, please. And again. So talking about this pharmaceutical supply chain, the supply chain has evolved over the course of the history of USP. So it has evolved over the past 200 years. Specifically, initially, medicines were produced locally. They were produced, you went to your local pharmacist. That wasn't called a pharmacist at the time, but you went there and they ground up the herbs that you needed to get, and that was how you got your medicines. Over time, there's been a specialization of the supply chain with different actors and even different regions specializing in different parts of the supply chain. So now you have raw ingredient producers, finished dosage form manufacturers, distributors, pharmacists, and other providers that are all involved. And throughout this sort of specialization of the supply chain, what has happened is margins have generally decreased, as has inventory. So it is almost a just-in-time supply chain with very little buffer between the various actors. And what happens, or what that means, is when there's a disturbance in that supply chain, the disturbance flows down through the supply chain. And so those disturbances could be things like peaks or spikes in demand caused by, let's say, a disease outbreak or a change in a treatment protocol, or disruptions in supply, whether that is because there's a natural disaster that is stopping the ability of people to get to work and to work in those factories, or whether it's a trade restriction where a country decides to stop exporting particular goods or chemicals. Next slide, please. Those disruptions in the supply chain manifest themselves, or can manifest themselves, as drug shortages. So this is a drug shortage is when a patient that needs a particular medicine is unable to get it because it's not in stock or not available in the hospital they're at or the pharmacy they go to. And drug shortages, unfortunately, are not new. So here on the left side, what you see is a 20-year history of drug shortages in the US. And on the right side, you see a particular, like an active snapshot, rather, of drug shortages as of September 30th, 2020. So you see they existed before COVID. They continue to exist in COVID. Now in COVID, what happened was the specific medicines that were in shortage, or in some cases, those changed because there were spikes in demand for particular types of medicines, specifically those that you use in intensive care units and for people who are on ventilators. But there were lots of other medicines that were also in shortage because they had been historically in shortage, and they had been in shortage for quite some time. Next slide, please. And if we look at the reasons for shortages or the reasons for disturbances, the primary reason, and this is data from the FDA pre-COVID, right? This is a report that came out in October 2019. The primary reason for drug shortages is actually quality issues. So this is a situation where a manufacturer has to stop manufacturing or slow manufacturing, or a producer of a raw ingredient has to stop doing that because they have issues in the quality of their product and the quality of their system. And this is US data. Very similar data exists in Europe as well. I mean, this is just really one of the main issues of shortages. Now, we see that increase in demand, at least prior to COVID, was a small fraction of, or was the driving factor for a small number of drug shortages. If we go to the next slide, please. And when you think about a resilient supply chain, actors within a resilient supply chain have to balance three main things. One is the price, or the cost of the ingredients and of the product that they're producing. Another one is the resilience of their supply chain. What I mean by that is how diversified is it? How able are they to switch between suppliers, for example? And what I'm describing here is true at all levels of the supply chain, whether it is a hospital thinking about where they procure their drugs, or whether it is a manufacturer thinking about where they procure their ingredients, right? You have this sort of trade-off between the price, the resilience, the supply chain resilience, and the quality of the thing that you're purchasing. And these three things have to be in balance. Unfortunately, the only thing that is readily available to a purchaser is price, right? It's cost transparency. It's easy to know how much something costs, or it's generally easy to know how much something costs. But it's really hard to know what is the quality history, or what is the resilience of my upstream supply chain? What are my suppliers? How resilient is my supplier's supply chain? And if we go to the next slide, we'll see an example of just how intransparent those supply chains are. So if we look at drug labels, we look at the labels on medicines, you typically know where you purchased the medicine from. And in about 55, 56% of the cases, you know who was the labeler or the packer for that medicine. But only in about 30% of cases do you know who actually manufactured that medicine. And only in about 3% of the cases do you know who was the active pharmaceutical ingredient manufacturer, meaning the producer of one of the key starting ingredients. And so this lack of transparency means that, as I said, the only thing or the main thing that people have to make their decisions on is price or cost. And therefore you get a race to the bottom. You essentially get a race to the bottom for lowest possible cost, because they don't have, most actors don't have transparency or visibility on the quality or the resiliency of the supply chain. If we go to the next slide. So USP decided to tackle this directly. And we created what we call the medicine supply map. We can click one more, please. The medicine supply map essentially was created to identify, characterize, and quantify risk in the upstream pharmaceutical supply chain so that stakeholders could do something about it, right? So by mapping out the active pharmaceutical ingredient manufacturers, the finished dosage form manufacturers, and looking at what do those networks look like, we are able to identify vulnerabilities or potential risks to the supply chain. Structural risks, right? We can say, oh, for this particular medicine, we see that all of the manufacturers are concentrated in one particular geographic area. So if a natural disaster were to hit that area, that's a potential risk. That's an example. Or we might say, oh, look, there's only one active pharmaceutical ingredient manufacturer for this particular product, even though it looks like there's 15 different products made by however many, 7 different finished dose manufacturers. They're all sourcing from the same active pharmaceutical ingredient manufacturer. So these structural vulnerabilities are what we are trying to understand through the medicine supply map. And let me give you just one tiny hint of the type of information that we're able to look at. And this is really just one example. If we go to the next slide. This data is data that we have access to, and it's basically, it's about the demand for hydroxychloroquine USP for USP's hydroxychloroquine standard. So I should have mentioned this earlier. The standards that we create are of different types. We have what we call documentary standards and physical reference standards. And the physical reference standards are the official version of the particular medicines when we have them, right? They say this is what, for example, hydroxychloroquine looks like. And so those standards are used in the manufacturing process and in the quality assurance process to ensure that the manufacturers have produced quality product. And so when we look at demand for our standards, what we're in effect seeing is a proxy for manufacturing activity. And here, what we have mapped is demand for our standard shown, across time. And we've highlighted a few interesting, let's say, news items. So in March, there was the hint that the thought that hydroxychloroquine might be a potential COVID-19 treatment. And we saw increase in demand, and therefore increase in production or presumed production of hydroxychloroquine. And then come April, we see a trial that shows that actually there's increased mortality. And then in June, we see that there really is no clinical benefit. And we're able to track that with the data here. So this is, as I said, just an example. We can also, as I mentioned, look for structural vulnerabilities in the supply chain. and other points. And I'd be happy to go into more detail. If we go to the next slide, please feel free to reach out. We'll be talking on this in this forum, but also please reach out to myself or Joe or Vimla. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And then let's move on to Paul Bowman, our final panelist.
Okay, thank you, Rob. If you could go to the next slide, please. And Rob talked about my experience at the beginning, so in the interest of time, we can move on to the next slide. So who is Covestro? We are one of the world's leading polymer producers. We used to be part of Bayer, the large German company best known for pharmaceuticals, but we were certainly a very large part of their portfolio at one time. We spun off in 2015. If you move on to the next slide, we sell into a variety of plastics and polymer segments, from polyurethanes to polycarbonates to coatings. So we're a raw material and intermediate supplier to the factories that Rob showed earlier on that make finished goods that end up in the consumer and industrial markets. So if you move on to the next slide. So we serve key industries. We have a variety of products and solutions to a diverse range of end markets. We're a global presence. We've got roughly 35 production sites around the world, with major sites in Texas, West Virginia, Ohio, Massachusetts, not to mention a number of locations in other parts of the world. And we're a leader in technology, constantly striving to reduce our carbon footprint and become more and more efficient as a producer. So if you move into the next slide. So our sales, our big sales go into the automotive and transportation market, but certainly also construction, wood furniture, and as mentioned earlier, electrical and electronics is certainly a growing part of our business, with applications in the microelectronics segment, computers, iPhones, cell phones in general. So just a variety of end uses that we sell into. If you move on to the next slide. So in North America, we've got roughly $3.5 billion in sales, with about 2,700 employees and a number of sites across the US and Mexico. If you move on to the next slide. And so how do we deliver product to our customer? Well, we are heavily dependent on the logistics sector, as Rob mentioned earlier. So railroads are certainly a very important part, ocean-going vessels, but certainly over the highway transportation is certainly a very critical part of delivering product to our customers. You move on to the next slide. So just kind of recapping, what did we see as a company? So we started work from home back in March. I would say that our transition was relatively seamless, with a lot of good IT capabilities and contingency planning that allowed us to move our operations to home. And most of us in the back office and administrative area outside of operations have been working from home for nearly a year now. About a decade ago, this would have been very hard with the state of IT at the time. Certainly today, it's been much easier than it would have been a while back. All of our manufacturing sites remained operational, with only essential workers reporting to the plant, many of the administrative people working from home. Overall, truck transportation was uninterrupted, but we'll talk in a little bit about some of the concerns that we have had that I think still need to be addressed going forward. Our Q2 volumes, really cratered there, as shown earlier. We declined 23% year on year, but we've certainly been seeing a nice recovery since then. We've certainly saw a big sales increase into the healthcare markets. But unfortunately for us, those volumes are not as big as what we would sell into automotive, furniture, and other high volume markets that saw some significant decreases. So that's kind of the story of Q2. If we move on to the next slide, let's talk about from July to present. We've had that V-shaped recovery that was talked about earlier. So our volumes increased significantly from Q2 to Q3 and moving forward. We still only have essential employees at our plants to minimize the possibility of infection. We've seen a significant increase in the building and construction markets, which Early on, we didn't anticipate, so we had to respond to it aggressively, driven by low mortgage rates, but also driven by work from home, leading to an increase in furniture sales and home renovations. Also, we didn't anticipate the spike in demand for appliances. So, and that continues to this day. Not only is appliance demand driven by the new construction, but it's also driven by the fact that people were wanting to get freezers and other appliances like that to store food. So there was concern about hunkering down and having a good supply of food on around, particularly early on. So that led to a big spike in demand for appliances, which continues to this day, and that segment continues to work to catch up with that demand. So overall, there have been significant challenges in forecasting future consumer demand. Segments that we thought would do better weren't doing as well, and vice versa. So it is really hard to anticipate going forward how these demands change, not to mention the fact that a shortage in semiconductors, like was mentioned earlier, which affects the automotive industry, can affect us since they're a major market for us. So customer production was hampered by shortages of key components, and certainly Gulf Coast hurricanes, which are an annual event, but certainly that didn't help in the midst of all of this. So if you go on to the next one. So I think overall, on the rail sector, we did quite well. I don't think we had too many concerns on the rail part of our business, delivering high volumes of product, but certainly the trucking industry was a vulnerability which affected everybody in our sector, not to mention other parts of the economy. So early on, there were driver concerns with COVID-19 infections being exposed to people as they delivered the product. So they were very concerned about that. And as a result, some of the drivers decided to permanently leave that industry. So they said, I've had enough. I've done my time. I'm just going to retire or move on to another business. And that leads to future shortages in drivers because you can't replace drivers overnight. The other thing that compounded the problem was many of the professional driving schools closed early in the pandemic, not to mention state commercial driver license offices. So you had experienced drivers permanently leaving the industry, compounded by a difficulty with a pipeline of getting newer drivers into the segment. And it takes roughly 6 months to a year to get people fully trained up to be a commercial driver. The other thing that happened early on, fortunately, that wasn't too prolonged, is that some states were considering closing their highway rest areas in the early months, which would have significantly harmed truckers as they move goods across the country. And also, I don't think early on we had a full appreciation of how critical that commercial trucking segment is to our industry and to all industries. So as Rob pointed out earlier on, we need that logistics infrastructure to get our products to the manufacturers, who in turn need logistics to get it to the end customers. And that whole trucking market has been very volatile since March, April. They declined there for a while, and now it's been taking off, and there's just been all kinds of shortages in trucking equipment and drivers ever since then. So if we move on to the next slide, that kind of wraps up my talk, and I'll turn it back over to Rob.
All right, thank you, Paul. We have a question from the audience, which I think would be a good way to start the discussion with the panel. We're asked, what sort of changes might the chemical industry see as a result of the Biden administration's executive order to review global supply chains, and when would they see them? Kevin, maybe I'll put you in the driver's seat for answering that question.
Well, I have not seen the executive order, just really summaries of it. So, in what it does cover, the details haven't come out yet, but it does represent an opportunity to examine and get analysis of these particular issues and the importance of supply chains. So, I'm looking forward to the research phase of that and some of the results.
If I could stick with you for a minute, Kevin, do you think that one end result might be a push for more reshoring of manufacturing so that the global element of the supply chain is not removed, but reduced in terms of its significance?
Well, it may be a likely outcome. I think you're starting to see that shift already, but it's been slow. I mentioned the Fukushima earthquake. There has been some shifting of supply chains because when that happened back in 10 years ago, there was one particular plant in Japan which supplied the semiconductor industry, and it was out for some time. So we've seen situations like this before, and I think it is leading to some diversification of supply chains and sourcing.
Maybe I can jump in for the pharmaceutical supply chain.
Yeah, please.
So the pharmaceutical supply chain, as I said, has specialized over the past decades, and I do think that we're seeing a push for onshoring of the manufacture of finished dosage forms and of some key ingredients, some active pharmaceutical ingredients. Some of that's was funded by the previous administration and is continuing under the current administration. And what's interesting there is I think that as we see onshoring of some of the manufacturing, we will see by necessity the adoption of advanced manufacturing technologies, which present new and different quality challenges that are important and interesting. At the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, our perspective and our belief is that supply chains must be and should be resilient, and that resiliency includes a domestic manufacturing infrastructure, but is not limited to that, right? That a resilient or a strong supply chain is one that has diverse sources. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Paul, any additional thoughts from a company-specific perspective?
Yeah, certainly looking at the executive order, the one of the thrusts was in electrical vehicle batteries, certainly of interest to us. We supply plastic into that sector that goes into the battery casing. So when people think about these high-tech batteries, they often think of the internals and some of the metallurgy that goes on in the internals, but certainly the casings themselves are made from engineered plastics, and we certainly have a interest in that and sell into that market and supply from domestic production into that segment. Having said that, there are vulnerabilities in some of these supply chains, even though the plastic itself may be manufactured in the U.S. Oftentimes in the engineering sector, these are formulated products. They may have 5, 6, 10 different components, and even though the majority of those components may be sourced domestically, you may have 1 or 2 items that are produced offshore, perhaps at only 1 or 2 factories, and just a disruption in a small component, a colorant, a pigment, something like that, can have real consequences there. So we've had to, our procurement group has been working quite closely with our technical resources to try to minimize the risk there, but it certainly is something where some reshoring might be helpful there for some of these critical additives, small in volume, but very high in terms of impact.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Building on that, or maybe expanding from that, are there other sectors or specific materials rather where you think the administration ought to be looking? Things that might be uniquely vulnerable. Not necessarily what Covestro makes, but for other materials, other manufacturing operations that might be worthy of federal attention. So
yeah, there was in reading the order, there was a heavy emphasis on pharmaceuticals, which is certainly important. But I think there's a broader issue, as has been touched upon numerous times here, with the whole medical devices and medical equipment, whether it's disposable tubing that's used in emergency rooms, whether it's ventilators, whether it's anything that's used in the medical sector. So I think we need to think a little more broadly than just the pharmaceuticals to think about medical equipment, which in many cases, for the purpose of sterility, are one-use things that need to be discarded because of the risks there, in which case you need to have a good supply chain there of those medical devices and medical equipment.
Thanks, Paul. Kevin, from a ACC perspective, are there any other products that you think of that might similarly benefit from further review?
Well, a lot of our downstream customers, they're important to us. For plastic resins, we're a large exporter to the world. And to the extent that some of our downstream customers may be relocating to North America, not necessarily the United States, if it's a labor-intensive industry, I think we'll see some of this play out.
So building on that, what's your view on the U.S.'s ability to handle a large wave of reshoring if that was to happen? I mean, what do you think that the industry is able to accommodate and be responsive to and serve the needs of manufacturing if it significantly returns to the U.S. and increases production here?
Well, as I mentioned in my presentation, that we're seeing a large expansion of capacity for basic petrochemicals, for basic chemicals and synthetic materials, advanced materials. And we already do export an awful lot, so we could service other new customers or reshored customers. But keep in mind that it takes time to add capacity in this industry. We're very capital intensive. So depending on the scale of the project, it could be as short as 3 years. It may be as long as 5 years to bring capacity on. So, and these are all considerations. It has to be a positive business environment as well. So.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that's those considerations will be relayed to the administration and the different entities within it that are working on this, following up on the directives of the executive order. Mike, Paul talked a little bit about pharmaceuticals. I didn't want to skip you on this question if you had any additional thoughts or were your thoughts covered already?
No, my thoughts were essentially covered already. With one thing that I think it's important, as I was saying, with regards to the goal that we have in the medicine supply map, which is to build transparency or to build a better understanding of the supply chain and therefore its vulnerabilities. I think that this increase in information and transparency is really important, and that would be something that I would encourage. Also, as I mentioned, the diversity of supply chains. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I think you anticipated a question that came in about visibility and transparency in the medicine supply chain. So great minds are thinking alike. We're coming up on the top of the hour. I wanted to give the panelists an opportunity. If you have a question to pose to any of the other panelists, now would be a good time to do so. If not, I don't believe there are any additional questions from the audience.
I have one last question. So this is for Mike. So you talked quite a bit about the pharmaceuticals themselves, but there's certainly the packaging for them. So the vials and the other ways of packaging the pharmaceuticals. Are you folks looking at that too? Are you, because I have read about, you may have five, just like us, you may have 5 or 6 components together, but you're missing that critical component in terms of packaging.
Yeah, so in terms of packaging, USP certainly has standards for packaging. We set the standards for those as well. But we haven't yet looked at the shortages or vulnerabilities in the packaging supply chain at this point. But it has been, as you said, I think it was Paul speaking, right? I think it has been an issue with things like vaccines, actually. So yeah, it's definitely an area to expand into.
Thank you for that answer, Mike, and thank you, Kevin, Mike, and Paul contributions to today's discussion. Your insights are appreciated. Thanks to the audience for your participation. Well, hopefully you learned something. You have questions or would like to follow up at all, you can email science_congress@acs.org, and we'll do our best to work with the ACS team to answer your questions. With that, our webinar comes to a close, and I look forward to the next one. Thank you, everybody.